Hey, good day wherever you are. I hope you're safe, not just from COVID-19, but there's some wild weather moving through the United States, the southeast, the northeast, which is why I'm in a car down at the Metro North train stop in Cold Spring. The power is out pretty much throughout our village and the town of Phillipstown. And I did find a spot here where I seem to have connectivity. I hope you're well, and I'll be joined shortly by Rebecca Bratspies, who's a CUNY law professor, focused for a long time on environmental justice and on climate justice in particular. We'll be talking about the current situation and with COVID-19 as well, because if you look at the map or the socioeconomic map of who's been most affected, obviously the virus knows no bounds. If a rich person touches a poor person or sneezes in the subway, the virus will be transmitted. The problem is the outcomes. What happens then? And that's where things get complicated. If you don't have easy access to medical care, you're in trouble. If you do, you're in less trouble. Boris Johnson had the best care in the world, and luckily is thriving over in the UK. He did a wonderful thank you note online yesterday to his caregivers, including nurses from various cultures, including one from Portugal. I wonder if he's lamenting Brexit, having had a nurse care for him who is from Portugal in the UK. Hopefully that nurse, I think it was a male nurse, still has papers to work there. It's a strange moment. So again, I'm here mainly to talk with students and a law professor from City University of New York Law School, but I'd happily answer your questions as well in context of what's going on around you. What are the complexities you've seen in terms of secondary impacts of this? Oh, here's someone who's popping up right now. Victoria. Whoops, she just went away. She'll be back. So in the comment stream here, if you're on Twitter via Periscope, or if you're on Facebook or YouTube, let me know what you're thinking and what are the complexities that you didn't anticipate. I certainly, I think a lot about the future. I think a lot about risk, about combined risks. I've been thinking a lot about tornado season down in the South, sadly, where people have been forced to have had their houses devastated by the tornado. I haven't reported yet on where they've ended up, but these questions are going to start to multiply going forward. So a couple of guests are about to pop into the studio here, I believe. I see Rebecca. Hey. Can you hear me okay?
Hello. I'm actually not hearing you.
You're not hearing me. Let me check my mic. Oh, that would suck. Hold on. Camera and mic.
Try it without my
FaceTime camera, high definition. Hold on. You cannot hear me right now? No. It should be working. No? Can you hear me? Let's see. I hear you. I hear you. You don't hear me? Let me try without these. Do you hear me now? Yes, no? You cannot hear me?
Now I gotcha. All right, I think I fixed it.
Okay.
Busy troubleshooting.
Yeah, here we go. We're all troubleshooting right now. I was just talking about that.
Yeah.
Welcome all, whoever might be online watching on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter via Periscope. And can you hear me still?
Yes.
Great, yeah. So I'm sitting in my car down at the train station. Of course, it's an empty train station parking lot. We have about 40-mile-an-hour wind here. It's been gusting much higher.
Wow.
And we lost power throughout the village of Cold Spring and Nelsonville, where I live. Here's someone else coming. Maybe I'll leave them off until they're fully.
Yeah.
And this is.
I got a number of the students, so hopefully they'll be joining us.
Yeah, I see Jill Sifa.
Oh, great.
And here's Jill.
Hey, Jill.
Hey, everyone.
And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you both. I wasn't planning to be in this studio audience, and I wasn't sure how to be an observer in some other realm. So, what should I do?
Well, we would love to have you be here.
You can be here. Yeah.
I mean, I'm
We
just
can
an
have,
auditor. I feel like I shouldn't take up space in the main audience here.
Your voice is really
Well,
important.
but yeah, and there's Anna is coming on shortly, I think here. Hold on a second. We can have up to 6 people and screen, and then the rest, the video. I sent links that go to anyone can watch on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter right now, live.
Where are those links on Twin? Where are those links?
They were. I think I sent them in the email.
I sent them to all of you, but I can send them again if you're.
No, if you sent them, I have them.
I think I sent them.
Is it in the login info for today? I'm not. Oh yeah, I do see it. I have it. I'm sorry, my bad.
That's okay. No, that's okay.
So you know what? I'll hop off at some point to let someone else come on and go to one of those links.
Yeah, we can have up to 6 in the video, and then the rest have to be on. I could post the links here too, just so people can see them. Give me a second. Let me know. So while I'm doing that, just introduce yourselves, the people who are on screen.
So I'll start. I'm Rebecca Bratspies. I'm a professor at CUNY School of Law, and I run the Center for Urban Environmental Reform. And this is my climate change class for the week. We're going to be talking with Andrew Revkin about climate change and coronavirus and the role of the press and the power of the press and the limitations of the press. Jill?
My name is Jill Sifa Sigman. I am a part-time first-year law student, and I'm also a professional artist, and I make work that relates to environmental and social justice issues.
That's great. We've had several artists on this on my my broadcast, if you want to call it that. Here, I'm just going to post it there. If anyone can see that link, that's the Facebook one, and I'll do another one for YouTube. So anyone who can't come in on the visual part, hold on. Here's YouTube. This should work for YouTube. I'll just take a second here to show this also. Yeah, so you can see, so if there's people in the class who want to get to watch this on YouTube live right now, or they can go to Twitter, twitter.com/Revkin, and see it live there too. So sustain what 0413, which is the date, YouTube, or sustain what 0413 FB for Facebook. And I do see some more people in the queue here, so, but I can only fit on. There's.
That's Genevieve.
Yeah, so that's 6. So that's the maximum right now. There's someone else in the green room, but he can't come in right now. Well, let's start to talk. And there's so many issues that are superimposed right now. It's hard to really get the full dimensionality of what's been unfolding. The one thing I'd start by saying is that I've been covering global environmental and social risk for 30 years. And so much of what you think about when you think of the climate problem it's about systems. It's not like an old-fashioned pollution source, like, a factory spewing something that you see the thing, science identifies the risk, and everybody goes, oh, we need a law because that's killing people. That can be very complicated sometimes too, because like right now with public health, the public health impacts of having several tens of thousands of people die from small particle pollution has some of the same dimensions of climate change. It's dispersed, it's statistical. It's not some glaring thing like happened in Minamata in Japan, where the mercury from a factory was killing people, literally distorting babies and killing people. So that right there tells you one of the relationships I see between what's happening now with COVID-19 and climate. It's dispersed and statistical, and it's really hard for us to really get our heads around issues where the impacts are in that, they're in the numbers more than like, even right now, I guarantee you there'll be debates in people's causes of death. You know, what do you put on the death certificate? If someone had diabetes and had heart disease and had high blood pressure, and oh, by the way, here they've just gotten the pneumonia because of COVID-19. It's a very complicated question, even though this one is simpler in many ways than climate change. And the justice issue is embedded in all of these things, because you have, you know, a big chunk of the world is much more exposed to climate impacts, whether it's climate change or not, than if you're in a rich country. 2007, we did a big series and a big package in the New York Times called The Climate Divide. And I can pop in the shortcut. You've probably seen that. Students have, at any rate. For others who are watching, I'm just going to throw the link here. The Climate Divide is essentially when I realized, I think the reason we ended up doing this story was I saw a story out of Australia that Perth, the city of Perth, was running short of water. And they built a sort of a wind-powered desalination plant. So they were able to substantially increase their water supply by turning wind into drinking water, essentially. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And I contacted a number of other reporters around the world, and we ended up cobbling together this picture of that mixed landscape. Samini Sengupta, who's now covering climate change, was based in India. A very powerful section of that story on how in a village in India, you know, devastation from flooding. And then a reporter, I'm blanking on her name right now, she was in the Netherlands, and she interviewed a woman who had just bought a house for 300,000 or 400,000 euros. That's not a houseboat, but it was a house that was designed to float when there's a river flood and then come back down. And she literally said, the quote was, "We look forward to floating." You know, so that right there says so much about the imbalance, right? But then what do you do about it? This has been in covering the treaty process, the climate treaty process for so long. There's this other part of the treaty. People pay attention a lot to the emissions reductions pledges, but theoretically, it was supposed to be, let me see if I can, I want to add Matt. Can I add Matt? I'd have to take someone, you can keep watching. Can I, let me just, Jill, can I pop you into the sort of silent mode so Matt can come in? Hold on. Anyway, you know, the Framework Convention on Climate Change and then the Paris Agreement is a subsidiary of that. In around 2010, countries pledged to, the rich countries said by 2020, by this year, $100 billion a year and funding would flow to the least developed countries to help them build their, not just cleaner energy system, but to build their resilience. And there's not, that money is not even remotely there. There's been a lot of the same kind of accounting magic has happened there as has happened with emissions to some extent. So, so the climate divide is real. Addressing it is incredibly hard. And then you take that to the city level, which I think is the focus of this class. In some ways, it's clearer. You know, again, you think about Sandy, you think about COVID-19. You know, everyone was affected to some extent. The power went out for everybody below 34th Street in Manhattan, but the ramifications, the societal impacts were highly uneven. Vulnerability to heat in the city is highly uneven. It's not, you can have the same heat wave and have a much more of an impact on unair-conditioned, low-income housing than you would in some, you know, fancy high-rise tower. So that's kind of the lay of the land. We can dive in more based on specific questions you have. And you're all distributed in space. I'd like to hear a little bit about where you are and what your situation is where you are as well. So maybe those who are on the video link can weigh in, and anyone who's watching from the class or otherwise can also ask questions via the text chat. So anyone have something they'd like to share, and either a question, or I would like to hear from each of you also, like, how does this affected you where you are?
So Phoebe, you want to start?
And let me, I've muted a couple of you. Let me make sure. Try to, if you keep your mute, hold on, let me just make sure that I haven't muted. Okay, so okay, you should be, Phoebe, you should be okay. Well set. Can't hear you though. Try again.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Phoebe Gittleson, also a 2L in Professor Bratspies class at CUNY. Climate change and the systems, the broken systems around our government is really what led me to law school, and everything that you're covering. I just have so many questions to ask you. But I'm really interested in, environmental justice at large and how we can prepare more for what is to come with the systems that we have in place, or trying to change the systems that we have in place.
That's a good question. Hold on. So one thing that I've made a point of writing quite a lot is that you can reduce people's vulnerability to hazards, to the impacts related to the climate system right now. You can do a ton of work on there. That isn't a function of lowering emissions. Like, lowering emissions is the grand challenge, right? Getting the stable concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is essential if we want to always not be running to catch up with impacts.
Right.
But that has the focus there. There's been a certain chunk of the climate community has been so focused on emissions reductions that they've really negated to look at the full landscape of how you reduce impacts and vulnerability right now. And some of that can be, Mike Morera is trying to get online on the video chat. Hey, Mike, I want to be sure you know that you can watch this live also. I can only fit 6 people in the video portion at a time. So after Phoebe is done with the question, maybe I'll bring you on, but you can watch it live. Just go to my Facebook page, or to Twitter, or to YouTube right now, my youtube.com/ANREVK. ANREVK. So anyone who can't get into the video chat should do that. So anyway, and that's the popular term for that is adaptation.
Yes.
But it's different. This is not just adaptation. It's vulnerability reduction is there. It's not adapting to climate change. Climate change is this long-term process. Climate variability and the hazards posed by climate are there. Like we just saw in the Southeast,
right.
Devastating tornadoes. And if any of you should go on Twitter and look up Stephen Strader, Strader. And he is a Villanova geographer, and there's Rob Verchick. Steve Strader's work, actually the simplest way to find it is to look for the hashtag expanding bullseye. And his work in tornado country has revealed powerfully that the biggest driver of danger, of losses, of deaths, of damage is this huge expansion and building of mobile homes and what are called manufactured homes, low-cost homes. Mm-hmm. And that's happening at a pace that is so far, it's like an order of magnitude more than any change in the climate system that you could relate to global warming, that you would say very clearly the best thing to do to limit poor people's impacts in tornado zones is affordable housing, probably affordable urban housing. Same thing in wildfire zones. The exposure to fire is growing way faster than climate is changing. So that's my main message on the vulnerability reduction can happen now. And often it's through focusing on low-income housing, on the other geographic issues that put people with limited means in harm's way.
Yeah, and I think just a follow-up on that, I think when we're in it, right, it's so easy to have this conversation. Like, you know, I know, everyone in this classroom, like, we've looked at the data, we study climate change, we want to solve the problem. But in so much of your writing, what I love to keep seeing and what I wanted to bring up today, or, you know, plant this seed with my classmates, is this idea of, you know, denialism and COVID really bringing this to light, where information, you said, I think in one of your articles, like, information doesn't really matter sometimes when you're talking about climate change. And, you know, when we emerge from this, like, how do we, I think that's the big question with climate change and coverage, right? It's like, how do we bring this perspective into the world that everything is a climate change issue? Water rights, you know, transportation, shelter, you name it, right? It's like, why isn't the media covering everything with a climate change or environmental racism or an environmental justice lens? And that was kind of the takeaway that I had from reading a lot of your work. And I just wanted to put that seed in the class.
Yeah. Well, you know, one way that I think I haven't actually written this yet. It's been on my mind for months. I wish there had been an intergovernmental panel on climate risk instead of an intergovernmental panel on climate change. And I should make that into, I really need to write that front, because risk is what matters, right? And the risk map around climate and energy, by the way, is very different than the climate change map. And the risk map has all these entry points, meaning, as we were just saying, and also for clean energy. Now, for energy, this is how it gets complicated and interesting, and really hard to make into a story. In 2017, right, 2018, I was in India reporting on cooking pollution, which is killing, right now, several million people are dying young. This is bigger than COVID-19, bigger than anything. It's one of these background realities, right? And it's from indoor cooking pollution, mostly women or kids, because who's around the house when that smoky fire is going? And but the solution in India, particularly, would be LPG, propane, fossil fuel. And Kirk Smith, who has been a prize-winning Berkeley environmental health scientist, who's made this point for decades, was attacked pretty aggressively by colleagues over the years for saying, in this case, the fossil fuel is the right ethical choice. It's the right medical technical choice. And India has moved ahead with subsidies for propane to get it into poorer households. In fact, middle-class Indians gave up their subsidy, which was a political one, for propane, so that there could be more money available to get propane into the households of poor families, so that fewer women will be exposed to high levels of smoke and die young. And so it gets complicated, but that map still is the map, I think, that has to drive. It's the one that most powerfully illuminates the justice question and the imbalance question related to either energy access or climate impacts.
You have that same issue with all development questions, right? In terms of preserving forests, preserving natural, ecosystems, right? It's the fact that degradation has happened everywhere else that means that we're now saying to people who have, preserved their ecosystems or not developed them, you can't touch yours because we need it.
Absolutely, and again. It's just a different way of mapping the problem. And when you do it, it's very inconvenient sometimes to maybe particularly to the sort of progressive Northern Hemisphere, fairly wealthy environmental community. Perhaps I'm just there. If you're so focused on no deforestation reduction that you're not looking at these systemic realities. This is even actually related to bushmeat right now. The whole question of, Ebola and the Asian viruses that seem to operate at that interface between ecology, non-human ecology, and human communities. It's fine to say ban all bushmeat. It's not fine to say then go hungry. So that's sort of a similar issue as well. I'm going to put up this thing here so that it's, hold on 1 second.
And on that issue, it's like factory farming is also problematic, right? And in our food systems, but we're focusing on bushmeat as also a problem that's, causing COVID and everything else. But science shows that so many other viruses and diseases can come out of our own food systems here in the US.
Yeah, although I think in a way that I had a conversation just a few days ago with a group of emerging scholars in ecological economics. It was the second one we did with Herman Daly, the great sort of the pioneering brain behind ecological economics. And there was a young woman from the University of Vermont who was talking about small agriculture as the solution. And we didn't have time to get into it, but this is where, it's to me, it's valuable to think about the system again. No one wants to have a industrialized food system that is polluting or devastating forests or involves injustice to workers, right? No one wants that. But we also don't want a million small farmers in China who have tiny farms with pigs, poultry, and babies all defecating together and creating viral factories. In fact, I did a piece in 2009 on the need in areas like that, where the case is stronger for industrial style agriculture, because you can monitor, you can do more supervision. The thing that was lacking at that time was adequate veterinary oversight, so that veterinarians need to be talking to the public health, the human public health people. This is this One Health concept. If you search for Revkin and One Health and 2009, you see in the context of H1N1 virus. So it's like, to me, this isn't about a lot of our journalism often, and a lot of our activism and our thinking tends to be between two, either this or that, either 100% renewables or what Trump tries to talk about. The reality, the reality to me often is more mixed, which means my version of journalism is more, lay out the landscape, no matter how inconvenient it might be, even for my own thinking, to test my assumptions, to test the way I come at a story, to not automatically think industry bad, small good, because that's not always the case. And unfortunately, our journalism these days particularly has become even more simplistic because of the, I'm just going to add someone here, more simplistic because the internet only pays attention to things that are crystalline and sharp-edged, right? When you're looking on your social media feed, things that are gray don't show up there very much. So that's a challenge, I think, in all of our endeavors. It's not just journalism. So let's see, are there other questions? And when you introduce yourself, say like where you are and what's going on.
Genevieve, do you want to go? I'm sure you have a reaction to what Andy just said.
Sorry, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Hi, I'm coming from Brooklyn, so it's I've been pretty lucky. I'm right by an industrial park, so there's not any like hospitals or anything near me, so it's been pretty quiet, and I get to go walk amongst like the empty warehouses, so can't complain about the position I've been in too much. But I'm just kind of wondering, as you and Phoebe were talking that through, there were even more kind of layers that I was seeing, because, obviously we can say there's a global north position and a global south position, but then if you go into so many kind of communities in the global south, you're looking at an overclass and an often indigenous, underclass who are both calling for two different things. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering, especially coming from kind of an American global north position, how can we support not only kind of climate activism, but also indigenous rights, while also not, fostering kind of like an imperialist mindset that I think American activists can often fall into without meaning to. And the other thing I just wanted to note, and this came to mind, I'm not sure why, but when you're speaking about the difficulty of counting the COVID deaths, it was really interesting to me because something I've worked on is criminalization of substance use during pregnancy. And with a lot of stillbirths in that context, even if they can't prove that the death was caused by substance use, if there's substances in the body, they will say it was caused by cocaine or what have you. So it's interesting that undercounts and overcounts are used in political ways and similarly.
Yeah, I couldn't fully hear everything you were saying about the indigenous question or the northern perspective in the context of that, but I think it's another arena where, you know, I did a lot of reporting in the Amazon in 1989, 1990, when I wrote my book, The Burning Season, about the murder of Chico Mendes, a Brazilian activist who was mainly a land rights guy. He wasn't like an environmentalist. He wanted the people of the forests to have a say in road building and the like. And he was murdered by ranchers. And I pay a lot of attention ever since then to those distributed voices. And there, I absolutely feel that that perspective is undervalued. I mean, that's all the way through the climate process, through decisions we make about resources, and it can get complicated. In Brazil, there are Indian tribes in the fringes of the Amazon and other areas who have embraced agriculture, modern agriculture. They've leased their land for soybean propagation. Now, is that wrong? Is that wrong for them as indigenous people who have land rights to lease their land for modern agriculture?
I mean, that's, I guess, kind of the conundrum, whether your focus is kind of self-determination and democratizing decision-making, or if your focus is a specific, I guess, climate goal. And I mean, I could see pros and cons from both ways, because obviously we do have kind of really real deadlines and real things that are coming up. But then, you know, there's also the question of who is making the decisions and who gets to veto those decisions even.
Yeah, and you know, I go back to my fundamental principles, I guess, are that the rights of it's there's no easy answer, right? Because it's like the rights of the individual communities, whether they're indigenous or not, or the people on the land have some important role to play in shaping the future of that land. Even if it's at the far end of a global system of trade for soybeans or forest. But then you do get back to this question of tensions over what we consider a global commons issue. You know, the atmosphere, the climate change question is a fundamental. There's a finite bucket up there for CO2 at levels that we think we can tolerate as a human societies. And how I thought it was valuable when there was this shift toward thinking of that as a budget. You know, how much of that account is left to spend, and but it still always comes down to this, to these pretty powerful issues about rights. India, in the climate treaty process, in the last rounds in the Paris discussions, was saying, you know, we basically own whatever carbon space is left because we are so undercarbonized compared to countries that essentially shaped the framework convention, the United States and others at the top from the 90s on. So whatever carbon space is left belongs to us because we need to get our better energy choices to our people. Electricity in a country with 1/3 of a billion people still with no reliable electricity. But that, you know, you could make all kinds of arguments back and forth. The United States, even under Obama, was not really happy about that. Well, I'll say I got into a fight with Secretary of State John Kerry's press people that week, the final week of the Paris Agreement discussions. I was reporting on it from here, from home, and I quoted an Indian newspaper that was very plugged into Modi's government. And they were saying that that night before, John Kerry was in a private session with India's negotiators, and he was really, you know, finger wagging and saying, you guys have to commit to getting off coal quicker, right? And India was pushing back. And I quoted that perspective. And I got this call from the John Kerry's chief of staff from Paris calling me, why are you quoting this Indian website? Like as if I'm on the USA team or something, as opposed to me as a journalist describing the landscape of arguments, including from a newspaper with a couple million readers, not like that website. I love that. That I knew was essentially expressing the views of the Indian government. So I guess what you really want in the end, whether it's indigenous questions about the fate of the areas of the Amazon rainforest, about the fate of how we shape the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, it's going to come through those kinds of discussions. And if there's a fair and open landscape where everyone has a voice, that can result in some sense of a consensus. It will never result in a hard agreement, right? This is what happened with the Paris Agreement. Was after a quarter of a century of countries trying to shape a firm targets and timetables, top-down contract, essentially, a contract, like a legal instrument that we would all the countries of the world would sign and abide by. After Copenhagen 2009, that model was finally abandoned, and there was a steady shift toward what's called soft law, soft diplomacy. There was a Thomas Schelling, who won a Nobel Prize in economics a long time ago. Before the Framework Convention, 1991, way back in 1991, he and others were arguing that this had to be soft law, not you're never going to get a contract. You can't get 200 countries to agree on anything without plasticity, without flexibility. And it took 25 years for the countries of the world to finally circle back to that reality. And it's always disappointing. It's always frustrating because it's so damn imperfect and pervious and plastic, but that plasticity is exactly why it could even happen. So and then you had at the global scale, some countries during the fires last summer, Macron did an idiotic tweet calling the Amazon our home is burning, like says, getting back at that old argument that the Amazon is a global commons. And as soon as I saw that, having written my book in 1990 about the history of the Amazon and the whole architecture why Brazil was settling the Amazon was based on making it firm that it was part of Brazil. It was Nossa Amazônia, our Amazon. It was ocupar para não entregar, meaning we have to occupy it so we don't lose it to all those, northerners. And to think that Macron was doing something smart by tweeting, our house is burning. I did some tweeting at that time trying to imply that was probably not a wise strategy. So I went on a little bit there. Hopefully I got at your core question.
Yeah, I guess I didn't really have so much of a question as I was just kind of interested in hearing your thoughts on that. So that was really interesting to hear.
There are some questions coming in on the chat here. I think Melanie is part of your group, I think. Is that right? Who should drive adaptation to address vulnerability? The state, private sector? I've noticed the coverage of COVID in the USA. The government is currently very resistant to being a welfare state. Yeah, that's true. Well, I don't know about that last part. I think the very interesting thing about this virus is, for the first time, I think, even libertarians are acknowledging that there is a commons, that public health, the concept of public health, isn't just like a moral thing. It's practical. In other words, if we have a landscape where this virus moves around too freely, even if you're not, ethically want to have the underclass, getting free healthcare. I'm just making that up. I'm not. That it's going to kick back and bite you. It's going to bite you in the economy. it's going to bite you in your own safety. So that's been really an interesting part of what's going on. There's so much tragedy unfolding. I don't want to even. It's been hard through these several weeks of doing this Sustain What webcast to think about the grander dimensions of these things without at least stepping back, like I'll do right now, and saying, there's so many people on the front lines here whose lives are being devastated, or there was just a report that 41 supermarket workers have died so far across the country. These are like grocery shelf stockers for their part in maintaining our functionality. But acknowledging those direct effects, also, I think it's important, even as we're going through this, to really think deeply about what it says about the public value, the actual value, whether you're pragmatic or just morally a group hugger and want everyone to have public health, a system that works. It's a moment where we acknowledge that we are all interconnected, that if you're not protecting all of society, that will now henceforth, these emerging threats like this one are going to demonstrate the actual cost that can be incurred to all. So it's an interesting moment.
Yeah, I have to say, I think you're underestimating the let it sweep through motivation that is, fairly significant. I think there's a tremendous amount of resistance to the idea that public health is a sort of a shared mutual benefit. And I also just want to clarify that Dr. Melanie Murcott was joining us from South Africa. She's a professor there.
Oh, great. Well, Melanie, thank you for being there, and I hope you're sharing this with others in South Africa and elsewhere. One of the sessions I'm planning to do in the next few days is on the impacts that are going to unfold in Africa. I've just been in touch through journalists in Zambia, Tanzania, and elsewhere, where this wave is just hitting, and the vulnerabilities there are enormous. It's a terrible event that's just getting going. The same thing in India 1 week ago today. If people look back at these conversations, the one I did was with a group of citizens in Bhopal in India, who are trying to fill the gap for the poor who have zero money, who can't get out to do the work they do for 100 rupees a day to sweep streets or anything, and are starving if they don't get food. So they built a food network using WhatsApp to get cooked food and get it to people who need it. So this is these issues are, everywhere, and the consequences will be huge in places like that. Your point is an important one about Rebecca, about that the resistance here. Although the other thing I've heard is that the adherence to, well, again, the media, we tend to focus on these outlier cases, like that amazing CNN interview with a woman going to church who said she's bathed in Jesus's blood and that's going to protect her. And, there has been apparently more adherence to the social distancing than was anticipated, than was modeled. So something about us for the moment, not everywhere for sure, has tended to have the upside part of each person be a little bit more on display than I think we anticipated. I'm not sure, the statistics will play out in the long run, and we'll see clearly the landscape of impacts and where people ignored this and how that affects the healthcare system and the like. I'd love to hear some more questions. I'm really glad this is working, sitting in this parking lot. It's raining really hard. So other thoughts?
I have a question. It might have been briefly covered in the beginning. By the way, I'm Anna Stebbins and I'm a 2L. So my question is, due to all these models coming out on COVID, I think all of us have heard of flattening the curve. Do you think that the public and governments will pay more attention to scientific expertise in other issues such as climate change or other public health issues that arise because of the current situation we're facing now?
I kind of think it's too soon to know. It's a good question. this could play politically in very different ways. We've already seen there was a tendency, even in the Trump administration, once he acknowledged that the catastrophe was unfolding, they highlighted that high-end mortality estimate projection. Mm-hmm. And that gives cover going forward to say, wow, look how much lower it was. Therefore, those scientists, were alarmists again. I've seen on social media, I've seen some of that already. Or it could play out as, wow, science really saved our asses because this could have been so much worse. And it's clear that the delay that did occur, as we've seen in the New York Times and documented so well, and Laurie Garrett and others, was so costly. The way these things play out in terms of who wins and loses politically are pretty complicated. And I think I'll say one thing. This is where President Trump's unbelievable capacity for sort of shape-shifting, like an endless Groundhog Day invention of a reality that he then conveys to the world, is deeply problematic, because it's very hard for the media. If you could look, you should look at the 2 sessions I did a week ago on the press and the pandemic. And Jay Rosen at NYU has made this point powerfully. He thinks that the mainstream media have failed utterly to find a way to not just simply propagate that steamroller effect that Trump has created, and to actually just stop broadcasting these disinformation campaign press conferences and just go straight to the sources of expertise. We're in a free country. Whatever the president says is still news, and that makes it really hard for the media. But it makes it possible to think of, in a few weeks, that some way he invents a new reality can still nudge this weird landscape we have in politics now of people who are so dug in support of him or not, that, and you put that against the uncertainty about the election itself. How are we going to vote? Is there going to be a resurgence of this virus in November and October? Significant prospect. So there's no way to answer your question, I think, unless it's just as scenarios. No one can predict what's going to happen. Here's another, here's another question. Oh, is that part 2? Oh, hold on. Whoops. My screen is so small. I normally do this on a bigger screen.
Victoria was asking about differential responsibilities.
Here we go, yeah.
How do we think about sort of the positionality and who's in what place in terms of what the responsibilities should be going forward? And it sort of goes back to both Phoebe and Genevieve's point of, there's different layers to this. One is we're all in this together and we need to solve the problem. And that's maybe true if we look at today going forward, but the fact is that we're not all in this together, because some of us have benefited dramatically from the choices that got us to where we are, and some of us hadn't. And to say, okay, now we all need to dig in. I mean, same thing with COVID-19, right? It's the people who are exposed to much higher levels of pollution who are much more vulnerable to this. And they're also the ones who are less likely to have access to healthcare. And they're also much more likely to be brown and black rather than white. And, all of those things are true at the same time.
Yeah, not to mention the financial impact.
Yeah.
As well, is not evenly distributed.
Right.
Not even remotely. So what would be the crystalline question at the core of that then? Like,
so I mean, I think the real question is, how do we grapple with on both of those levels at the same times? How do we convey to people who don't see their advantage and don't see their privilege, that they are in fact the beneficiaries of a system that has sort of captured an undue share of the carbon, or an undue share of the economic power in this society, or wider societies, when those people don't see that about themselves, and in some cases, on a relative scale, are not at the winners of this particular society, even though by being in this society, they're benefiting from past wins. I lost myself in that sentence.
No, but I know what you, in other words, how do we, more than a decade ago on my blog, at the Times, I wrote a piece examining this question. I'll just talk about public health. Like, how do you concretize public health? How do you make that a more meaningful part of decision making? We already have that in our law. Clean air laws kind of have that. And it came down, I was at a meeting once with Howard Koh, K-O-H, who was at the Health and Human Services at the time. And we were discussing this question of how do you make that real? It's not like someone getting hit by a car. And it came down to me to questions of communication, partially. Like, how do you show that? And there have been some great visualization experiments in recent days on COVID-19. How do you tell that story in a way that disentangles those multiple paths of risk, so that we shape our healthcare system or our energy system with that more in the mix? And it's really hard. I think Gates Foundation in the 90s, I think, they funded this whole line of work on a global effort to use statistical means to actually look at that public health landscape. And they found, for example, that you could actually estimate how many strokes were from exposure to small particle pollution in the household. And what proportion of strokes that would happen in a year are from indoor air pollution, and what percentage are from high blood pressure, et cetera. And you can start to do it with epidemiology. But again, that's still just step one. It's like in India, the question I mentioned about propane versus biomass as a fuel in hundreds of millions of homes, the change started to come around so that they started to think more holistically through the Ministry of Energy, because they had an interest in, what do we do with propane here? It's being wasted by restaurants, and people who are middle class are getting a subsidy. And they started to have a more integrated assessment of how you look at health and energy in one room at the same time. And I think that is part of the answer. So we can do the number. The statistics are there. The question is then, how does that shift into policy making? And I think that's like Arizona State University has this, for more than a decade, they've had this experiment, what they call a decision theater. It's kind of a room where, whether it's for national security or other reasons, you go into a room, you have the data at hand. You can start to look with some technical, more science, more data in the room at some of these tough intersectional questions. And I think every university should have a decision theater so that you can play these games and actually help, whether it's the city of New York or help the country, or at the global scale, try to get some more clarity on pathways on issues that have these dimensions that we literally can't get at otherwise. This came up in a session here just on Friday with Rod Schoonover, who was on the National Intelligence Council for 10 years. He's the one who quit the NSC when the Trumpians were not letting him testify fully on climate at a climate hearing. And Alice Hill, who's a climate adaptation and person, now Council on Foreign Relations. She was in the National Security Council, and she also was on a biohazards panel a decade ago under Obama. And we talked about AI even. We know that we're really bad at exponential risk, exponential curves. That's come out really clearly right now. We know that we're really bad at deep uncertainty. For example, sea level rise. it's clear we're in for multi-meter sea level rise in the next 1,000 years, multi-meters, up to 15 feet, 20 feet. It's really unclear how fast it's going to be between now and 2100. It's still it could be a foot, it could be 3 or 4 feet by 2100, and that's still a level of uncertainty that's real. It's not like it's deeply understood uncertainty, but we suck at decision makings and deep uncertainty. So that, I think, thinking about what academia can do to help with that interface between information and response, I think is an important part of the path forward too. I'm hoping at Columbia, we're kind of gifted having the Earth Institute with 700 people, a big chunk of climate scientists, people at Lamont who measure soil chemistry, pollution, arsenic and water, and incredible science capacity. We and CUNY have great capacity in law and policy. And what are we not directly doing to help communities right now at this juncture, when we know that these issues are multidimensional, when we know that if our law schools aren't talking to our engineers and our climate scientists, we're not going to get resilience right. That it feels like part of, I think there's no easy answer unless academia finds a way to dive into that space. It'll just make these things that much harder. I assume that that's been a conversation that's underway at CUNY as well.
Yeah.
We're actually, if things are remotely near functional in September, we're holding a meeting with NYU and with Fordham. I can't remember the dates right now, on universities and sustainability and cities. Like, what can we do to be more useful, in real time? So that's something we could talk about for sure with you guys too, if you're not already in the loop on that.
Yeah, I don't think the law school is, but I can't imagine that CUNY as a whole isn't, because we are the city of New York's school.
I know. So, but let's make sure we don't drop this conversation without answering that question. I could get you the information on what's happening. The guy at NYU, it's Gurno Wagner, who's just moved there recently, and he's a super climate economist.
Let's let Matt.
So
have a
we
chance.
have a little, my battery. I have 20% battery in my laptop. We have, we can go a little longer.
Mhm.
Other questions?
So Matt, you've been waiting so patiently.
You have to unmute. Let me make sure. Hold on. You have to do it, I think.
Got it. Hey, Andy, how you doing? Thanks for doing this. I'm Matt. I'm currently hunkered down in Queens from COVID and the weather today. And I actually live 2 blocks from a hospital, so every few minutes, actually, we're hearing sirens, and like the efforts of the EMS workers are really noticeable here. You've touched on so many things that I've kind of scraping at my brain here to ask you about, but I guess one thing that I've been noticing between the response to COVID-19 and the climate is sort of like that urgency aspect, where you'll see states just, the governors will say things like, "Oh, we're not doing that. We're not California. It's not here. Don't worry about it." And then all of a sudden they get an outbreak and it's a completely different tune. And I was just wondering, in regards to climate change, how you think that will look when finally, either in the US or globally, how that urgency might manifest itself to get sort of a response that can address it.
Yeah, this has been a long-standing, I would say it's fair to call it a wish.
Yeah.
That there'll be sort of a Pearl Harbor moment, or a urgency will reach a level where, like I just mentioned earlier, public health now, the value of public health, meaning the value of widespread access to healthcare, is vividly apparent now. So there'll be a new discussion about how many hospital beds per 1,000 people in America is the right number. And clearly we're not at the right number. So you would like to think that will happen with climate. I've dug in on that a lot, and I worry that there's an aspect of climate impacts that came out in the work of George Marshall, for example. He's a British climate campaigner, longtime communication expert, who wrote a book with the worst title in the history of books, because I can never remember it. But it's George Marshall. And he was in Texas in 2010 after wildfires swept through east of Austin. These communities, I wrote about this quite a bit at the time. And he found, I don't think it was a statistically valid sample, not like a big thorough study, but people who you would identify as kind of libertarian survivalists, when they were affected directly by a fire, it tends to make them more of who they already were. Yeah. And if you're a communitarian, do-gooder, group hugger, it tends to make you more of who you already were. so that, and we've seen this discussion, I'm sure you've read stuff, David Wallace Wells or others who, you can see going forward that when climate impacts worsen, countries will become more authoritarian. Actually, look at COVID-19, right? The solution to COVID-19 is mass surveillance. Like it is. I mean, whatever you want, and socially, the only way out of this is when we move from what's called the hammer, meaning lockdown, to the dance. There's this hammer and dance thing. The dance is all about awareness. So when a case pops up, you want to know, you have to be able to contact trace who that person was exposed to the last 2 weeks. And that only happens if there's like an app on your cell phone saying, where have you been the last 2 weeks, blah, blah, blah. So the urgency is not our friend.
And yet, Andy, I just want to say, we have that without the government, right? We have private companies posting
private.
That.
No, I know.
I mean, surveillance is not necessarily just about the government. It's also about, corporate actors who have a great deal of interest in selling to us wherever we are and selling us.
Oh, I know. Well, there's grander questions that I've touched on a little bit about how do you keep an open internet? How do we go forward there? If there's a way to start paying for services so that we're not paying by losing our privacy, paying by losing our data, we're heading down a road that's problematic there too. I think that still just amplifies this idea that
staggering.
Beware what you wish for.
Yeah. George, the book by George Marshall was Don't Even Think About It, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure. He's easy to Google for. Oh, wait, here's Rob Verchik.
Thanks, Rob.
Unmemorable. Yeah. Don't even think about it. Why our brains are wired to ignore climate change. By the way, I encourage all of you to go back a week on New Yorker Radio Hour or the New Yorker, go to the website for their podcast. They interviewed Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, a behavioral scientist, for decades of work illuminating why we make bad choices and why we make good choices and how we don't perceive things right. And Kahneman was very frank. He said, I totally missed. He said, I think about this all the time, and I completely underestimated COVID-19. He said he was poised to fly to France, I guess in February, and when he chose not to, it wasn't because he had run the numbers. It was some other reason or something. But so if even Daniel Kahneman, whose whole legacy has been thinking fast and slow and getting a better grip on our own capacity to understand the future and acting on it, if he can't get it right, that leads me back to that conversation with Rod Schoonover and Alice Hill about, well, is there an app for that, but can we at least build in some dashboard of systems that can help us understand when these levels of complexity are such that it's kind of a little glowy light starts to glow brighter. Hey, humanity. Hey, New York City. Hey, whoever at whatever level, you're getting into this territory where you are going to get this wrong. Therefore, here are some options. If we don't have that, I think we can have that capacity. Who builds it? Who designs it? Who sells it? As Rebecca was saying, is still an open question, but or we can do it just using our global intelligence. We're going to need that because the level of complexity in a globalized world where something that happened in Wuhan, China, it's not a China virus. It's an animal human virus. It's a wet market virus. And that's the thing that was missed in that big flurry around Bill Maher the other day. Take away the race questions. This emergent risk is a function of a globally knitted human species. So knitted that in the space from November to now, every single life on the planet, except perhaps, and actually the Yanomami Indian just died of the virus deep in the Amazon. So that's astounding. That's astounding. You know, the atmosphere is globally mixed, right? CO2 from everywhere on the planet is building in a way that will affect us all long term. Obviously, again, unevenly. And here we have biology is now so knitted that a viral particle moved from one species to another in November and has become this global phenomenon in ways that without coordination at some level, we're always going to get wrong. And that's pretty amazing.
So, and you know, there's another layer of connection and integration there too, which is in this globalized economy that we have, the fact that, you know, that there's a crisis in Wuhan means that there's a crisis everywhere.
Yeah, and it means that countries better do a much better and more honest job of sharing information. China, if you haven't read, Laurie Garrett did a devastating piece in the New Republic a week or so ago on both Xi and Trump, documenting in detail how China's decisions and tamping down those early warnings from public health and epidemiology is a big chunk of why this happened. And of course, the Trump aspect is huge as well. And there's many other failures. By the way, I do encourage you to go back to the Friday discussion I had with Alice Hill and Rod, and we all, Alice particularly, she said, you know, fundamentally, this is a failure of the imagination. She said 9/11 was a failure of the intelligence system's imagination and a failure of connectivity. 9/11, it was just quickly.
A lot more.
Well, 9/11 just quickly, you know, the FBI wasn't talking to the CIA.
Yeah.
And so the fact that there were Middle Eastern guys taking flight lessons in Florida
And not wanting to
get
look at
to the broader landscape of decision making, and
you know,
here the failure of imagination is about connectedness. Like, wow.
I mean, I think that in both cases, it's really a failure of communication because there are plenty of warnings. And the fact is that all of the laws that we had pre 9/11 could have stopped those attackers had there been the effective communication. Just like, I mean, my students, now, I've been following this outbreak obsessively since January because I have friends in Wuhan who were under lockdown. But you know, like all of the signs were there. It's not a matter of a failure of imagination or information. It's a failure of paying attention. And that is exactly, I think, a replication of 9/11, a failure of paying attention because the signs that were there either are inconvenient or are inconceivable, not because they're not there.
Yeah, although, again, this would be a good, your students should listen to that session because Rod, who was on the National Intelligence Council right through this, he was part of the writing team on the last one that warned about pandemic risk. He said, but, you know, in a way, it was on page 21. So if you Google for me, my name, Revkin, and page 21 effect, I call it the page 21 effect. It's like, yeah, the information is there. Yeah, even sometimes when it's shared, it's there. But it's like, then the action space, the decision space, as you were saying, Rebecca, it's our reactions to the information at the level of decision making that can create this big miss. You know, we're missing the big things because there's this near-term list of things, and there's these bigger questions. Even if they're profound, they're not getting the weight in the decision making. And I absolutely, of course, the reason I've created at Columbia an initiative on communication and sustainability is because I think even in academia, you know, I have a lot of great colleagues who teach in journalism schools. I have a lot of great colleagues who are communication scholars, but I don't see a lot of initiative and effort and investment in this, what I see as a new feature of the Earth system. It's our communication system. We've been communicating, obviously, all through human history, but it's never been a real-time thing. It's never had the potential so that you can see now how much coal a Chinese power plant is using, And that used to be the province of the CIA, and now it's public information, basically. Well, it's sort of quasi-public, private, because the people who own the satellites are allowing some use of that for the public sphere. But and then you have this globally interconnected thing. You have social media, which is this sensory apparatus that can reveal flu trends, as Google discovered 10 years ago, just through what people are searching for. But it can also distract. It's designed to distract and divide us. It's designed to validate you 1 second and then piss you off the next second, and that's how it keeps you engaged. And we're not really thinking actively about how do we work as a community of scholars, as a community of lawyers, as a community of progress-oriented people to get the best out of it, as opposed to just tweeting amongst ourselves about something. I think it's a frontier that we are not adequately engaged on yet. My battery's down to 5% now, so last question.
All right, so let Rachel texted in a question from the class. Right, she says, solving climate change is an accessibility issue. Academia isn't accessible to all, but the media is. How can we encourage the media to take on these issues in a way that is more accessible?
Don't rely on the media. Just do it. Like the session I did last Wednesday with these young scholars in ecological economics. Like, they don't even have a field. Herman Daly in that call, he said, the schools that founded ecological economics, where he was, don't even have ecological economics anymore, right? Wow. So what they are doing, what I was helping them do a little bit on that day, was these scholars at Waterloo University, McGill, University of Vermont, a couple other schools, they're building their discipline through global connectivity. And we were talking about how do you sustain and build that. Create the media, the word media applies to these media. Mm-hmm. The media saying, when will the media fix our problem? As if the New York Times is going to magically write something that will fix these problems is I think, a flawed way of thinking about where we go from here. Take hold of these media. Build your presence online. Build your presence as a community, face to face when you can. And then the other thing that came up on these talks I've been doing these last few weeks is that, we're all feeling constrained, like having these conversations online is totally limiting. It is. We can't hug each other, right? We can't share a cup of coffee, whatever. But the upside is that you can connect right now with citizens on the ground in Bhopal, India, to see if there's some way to help facilitate what they're doing. That the upside of this constraining, weird, two-dimensional digital way of reacting to each other is profound. And that's like, I think the more we can do to push that forward, the better off we'll be as well. And I think Rebecca actually dropped out just then. So I'm down to 4%. I think I'm going to have to stop. And we could do another round here. And this is all public and shareable. It's all going to be archived when we're done. So make sure you share it with friends and other people there on campus or elsewhere, and start to think about some of the ideas that emerged here and what we can do to build forward, not always rebuilding. And I think a really important thing for academia right now is not to assume that this is some kind of a patch. Like what we're doing right now is sort of a temporary fix for the way we were doing things before. Thinking of it as a new way to do things with limits and with great potential is a good part of how to go forward. So I'm sorry that we were constrained a little bit. It's great to meet you all, Matt and the others here, Genevieve and Nicole and Naomi and Brian, Jill. And we could do another round in a week. I got nothing but time.
Yeah, hopefully you have power then. But yeah.
All right. So thank you all, and make sure there's Rebecca. She just said something. Sorry, I got cut off. Rebecca, this was great. We will let's do a chapter 2, right? I'll try to connect you guys with some of the other students who we've been talking to, and sift back through some of the earlier sessions. They've been pretty illuminating, and I'm hoping that each one will get a little bit richer and more outcome oriented as we go forward. So thanks a lot, everybody. CUNY Law School. Take it easy. Ha ha. Take it easy. Ha ha ha. And Rebecca says, let's keep this going. I couldn't agree more. All right. Bye-bye.